There is a certain kind of person who walks into a room and instantly, almost involuntarily, feels the invisible currents of energy flowing between everyone present. It is an experience that the outside world often romanticizes as a superpower, a gift of emotional intelligence, or profound intuition. But to the person experiencing it, it rarely feels like a gift. It feels more like a heavy, unyielding burden. To the untrained eye, this person might simply seem quiet, introverted, or highly observant. They sit in meetings, attend family dinners, and go on dates looking perfectly composed. But beneath that calm exterior, their mind is running a relentless, exhausting marathon of analysis. They are passively decoding a forced smile, measuring the exact, uncomfortable duration of a silence, and translating the subtle shift in a colleague's posture into a complex, hidden narrative of unspoken frustrations and ulterior motives. This profound, almost debilitating level of perception is often termed hyperawareness. It is not merely a quirk of personality, nor is it simply overthinking. It is a deep-seated neurological and psychological phenomenon. People who live with this condition possess a brain that lacks a fundamental off switch. They cannot simply exist in a moment. They must process it, take it home, pull it apart, analyze its components, and replay it in their heads until the early hours of the morning. They are the kind of people who can take a single, slightly out-of-tune text message and build an entire universe of anxiety around it. To understand why this happens, we have to look past the symptoms and dig into the origins of this sharp awareness. Why do some people become biological radar stations, while others can happily walk through life completely oblivious to the emotional weather around them? Empirical psychology and neuroscience generally divide the origins of hyperawareness into two distinct categories: biological inheritance and environmental adaptation. For the first group, this extreme sensitivity is an innate biological reality. They are born as what psychology classifies as highly sensitive persons, or HSPs. This trait, formally known in scientific literature as sensory processing sensitivity, SBS, is found in roughly 15 to 20% of the population. If you belong to this group, your nervous system was built differently from the moment you took your first breath. Your brain functions like a highly calibrated, ultrafine filter that automatically absorbs and processes internal and external stimuli more deeply than the average brain. This is not a disorder. It is an evolutionary survival strategy. In prehistoric times, having a segment of the tribe that noticed the subtle shift in the wind or a slight change in an animal's behavior kept the group alive. But in the modern world, this highly tuned nervous system means the environment always appears in overwhelmingly high resolution. The lights are brighter, the noises are sharper, and the emotional states of other people are broadcasted at maximum volume. Your brain does not filter out the background noise of human interaction. It absorbs all of it, processing every microexpression and tonal shift as critical data that must be analyzed. For the second group, however, hyperawareness is not a biological lottery ticket. It is a learned survival strategy. It is a neurological inheritance forged in the fires of an unstable, unpredictable, or emotionally volatile childhood environment. Neuroscience refers to this state as hypervigilance. Imagine a child growing up in a home where the emotional weather could turn violent or deeply depressive without any logical warning. In this environment, the adult's moods change like the wind. That child cannot afford the luxury of innocent oblivion. To survive emotionally, and sometimes physically, they must learn to become a human radar station. This is the child who learned to memorize the specific sound of car tires rolling into the driveway, listening closely to the speed, and the braking to predict whether their father was coming home angry, drunk, or sober. They learned to measure the exact acoustic resonance of a kitchen cabinet closing to gauge their mother's level of resentment. They knew precisely when it was safe to step into the living room and when they needed to dissolve into the background and become entirely invisible. Biologically speaking, this environment fundamentally alters the development of the brain. The amygdala, the brain's primitive threat detection center and danger alarm, becomes chronically activated. It hardwires a powerful, subconscious message into the nervous system. This environment is not safe. You must constantly scan the horizon for subtle shifts in behavior to avoid impending disaster. No one explicitly taught this child to do this. Their developing nervous system automatically built a dense network of neurons dedicated to predicting emotional disasters before they could happen. Fast forward to adulthood, and that childhood radar system has not only persisted but expanded. The shield that once protected them has fused into their skin, becoming an inescapable part of their identity. When this massive, protective awareness enters adult life, it manifests in several distinct, exhausting psychological realities. The first and most energy-consuming of these is living in a state of constant, inescapable analysis. For a typical person, a conversation is just a conversation. An email is just an email. But for the hyper-aware person, the mind is always running a hidden equation in the background. Take a standard workplace scenario. Your boss sends a message on Slack at 4:00 p.m. on a Friday. Come see me for a minute when you have a chance. For a person with a standard baseline of awareness, this is simply a mundane administrative request. But for the hyperaware individual, the moment those words are read, an immediate wave of physiological tension floods their body. They sense something unusually cold in the phrasing. They notice the lack of an exclamation point or an emoji that the boss usually uses. They feel the digital atmosphere of the sender and instantly begin interrogating themselves. Is my boss upset? Did I mess up that client presentation? Are they restructuring the department? This relentless processing is tied directly to the brain's default mode network, DMN. The DMN is a network of interacting brain regions known to be active when an individual is not focused on the outside world. It is the system responsible for self-reflection, daydreaming, and mind-wandering. In most people, the DMN quiets down when they engage in a task or a conversation. But in hyperaware individuals, this network is perpetually overactive. They cannot simply enjoy a cup of coffee with a friend. Half of their brain is participating in the conversation, nodding, and holding the mug. But the other half of their brain is quietly taking notes, comparing present behaviors to past interactions, analyzing microexpressions, and silently questioning why the friend hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before offering a compliment. This means their mind rarely gets any true rest. They can feel entirely depleted and exhausted after spending a day sitting quietly in an office because their brain has just finished running a marathon of hidden social calculations. This relentless analytical camera does not only point outward, it inevitably turns inward, resulting in a state of hyper-self-awareness. In psychology, the ability to think about your own thinking is called metacognition. It is largely controlled by the prefrontal cortex, the most highly evolved part of the human brain. Everyone has this ability, but for the overly aware person, the metacognitive switch is jammed in the on position. They do not merely experience an emotion, they actively monitor, dissect, and judge it in real time. The familiar chain reaction goes like this. An emotion appears, the brain immediately isolates and analyzes it, and then the inner critic harshly judges it. Imagine they are walking through a park on a sunny day and suddenly feel a wave of profound sadness. Instead of simply letting the emotion wash over them, acknowledging it, and letting it pass, their prefrontal cortex immediately intervenes. They mentally cross their arms and demand justification. Why am I sad? Does this sadness even make logical sense? I have a good job, a roof over my head, and my health. I should feel grateful. It is selfish and pathetic of me to feel empty right now. Even moments of spontaneous joy are tainted by this metacognitive surveillance. They might laugh loudly at a joke during a dinner party, only to immediately have a detached, observational part of their mind float up to the ceiling, look down, and critique the performance. Did I laugh too loudly? Was that socially appropriate? Did that sound fake to the people sitting across from me? It is the psychological equivalent of trying to dance freely while constantly staring at your own reflection in a mirror to correct your posture. You might execute all the steps perfectly, but you completely lose the natural flow, rhythm, and joy of the dance. As their depth of awareness increases, their ability to be naturally present in their own lives slowly disappears. As this analytical camera continues to roll year after year, it slowly erodes something very precious: relational innocence. This is the ability to accept human interactions at face value, trusting the surface of words and gestures without suspicion. Because hyperaware people have spent a lifetime observing the backstage of human behavior, they develop an exceptionally strong theory of mind: the cognitive ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, intents, and desires to others. They realize early on that people rarely say exactly what they mean, and that social behavior is often a complex performance. When a coworker spontaneously brings them a coffee and praises a recent project, their brain immediately bypasses the pleasantry and begins scanning for motives. What favor are they about to ask for? Are they trying to soften me up to take on their weekend shift? They begin to see that kindness often comes with invisible conditions attached. They recognize that human affection can sometimes be a calculated emotional investment, and that the overwhelming confidence a person projects on a first date is often just a theatrical curtain hiding a desperate fear of rejection. This creates a quiet, profound sense of isolation. It is not the loss of childhood innocence, it is the loss of relational trust. A compliment always seems to carry hidden layers. An apology never feels entirely complete because the hyperaware person suspects the other party is only apologizing to de-escalate the tension, not because they genuinely recognize their fault. Promises sound fragile. These individuals rarely become bitter, hostile, or hateful toward the world. Instead, they simply become overwhelmingly cautious. They often feel intensely lonely even in crowded rooms, because no one else seems to see the complex, underlying layer of truth that is entirely obvious to them. This deeper layer of truth is not just a cold, logical observation. It sinks directly into their nervous system, triggering an empathy switch that cannot be turned off. For the hyperaware person, empathy is not a conscious skill they choose to deploy when a friend comes to them for advice. It is a biological state of absorption. They can walk into a boardroom where absolutely no one is speaking, yet they can immediately feel the heavy, suffocating weight of irritation and conflict hovering between two coworkers. Psychology differentiates between cognitive empathy, understanding someone else's perspective, and emotional empathy, actually feeling someone else's emotion. For the overly aware person, cognitive empathy instantly crosses the border into emotional contagion. They literally absorb and live inside another person's pain. This phenomenon is tied to the brain's mirror neuron system. When we watch someone express an emotion, these specialized neurons fire as if we are experiencing that emotion ourselves. For a highly sensitive or hyperaware brain, this mirroring is drastically amplified. If someone sitting next to them on the subway is tapping their foot with intense, nervous energy, the hyperaware person's own heart rate will begin to sink and accelerate. If a friend calls them crying over a painful divorce after they hang up the phone, that heavy, aching grief will sit inside the hyperaware person's chest for 3 days. As a result, they inevitably become the designated emotional regulators for everyone in their lives. They know instinctively how to soften their vocal tone, choose the perfect calming words, and de-escalate tense atmospheres. People love being around them because they feel deeply seen and understood. But the hidden price of this dynamic is total emotional exhaustion. They become a container for other people's unprocessed emotional waste. And tragically, at the end of the day, very few people realize that the person who is always so strong and understanding for everyone else desperately needs someone to understand them. Emotions that are constantly absorbed and suppressed do not simply vanish into thin air. They move directly into the physical body, where hyperawareness manifests as a physical anxiety loop driven by a highly sensitive interoceptive system. Interoception is the neurological ability to perceive and sense the internal state of your own body. It is governed heavily by a brain region called the insular cortex. People who are mentally overaware almost always have an extremely sensitive interoceptive network. Consider what happens when they drink a strong cup of coffee. The caffeine naturally causes a slight increase in heart rate. For a normal nervous system, the brain registers this simply as a state of being awake and alert. But for the hyperaware nervous system, the insular cortex detects the elevated heartbeat, panics, and immediately flips through its traumatic data records. It shouts a warning to the rest of the brain: fast heartbeat equals danger, we are under threat, a panic attack is starting. Completely normal physical sensations, a slight change in breathing, a muscle twitch, a minor stomach ache, are exaggerated and misinterpreted as catastrophic warning signals. This creates a brutal, self-fulfilling loop. A physical sensation appears. The brain misinterprets it as danger. The amygdala activates a full fight-or-flight stress response, dumping adrenaline and cortisol into the bloodstream. This surge of stress hormones actually creates the severe physical symptoms they were afraid of in the first place. The tragic result is that their own body becomes a constant stream of emergency data. They feel restless, uneasy, and on edge at all times, even when they are sitting on their couch, and absolutely nothing is wrong. When the overwhelming barrage of signals from the outside world and the internal body becomes too much to bear, the hyperaware mind searches for a way to restore order. This is when awareness quietly mutates from a tool of observation into a desperate strategy of control. This is not a forceful, manipulative control over other people. It is a subtle, inward-facing defense mechanism. The hyperaware person begins operating on a deep, unspoken psychological belief: if I can predict every possible variable and map out every potential disaster in advance, I will never be blindsided by pain. Understanding becomes their armor. They believe that if they can clearly see the landing point of disappointment weeks before it happens, they can brace for impact and prevent themselves from collapsing. Their mind begins running high-level simulations nonstop in the background of their daily life. They ask themselves a million variations of what if. What if this relationship fails? What if they suddenly pull away? What if I lose this job tomorrow? If the worst-case scenario actually happens, what is my exact step-by-step reaction plan so I don't fall apart? This leads to a paralyzing state known as analysis paralysis. They trap themselves inside a maze of assumptions, actively living in 10 different chaotic versions of the future, dissecting every possible risk before the present moment has even fully unfolded. The cruelest irony of this protective strategy is the massive trade-off it demands. In their desperate attempt to stay one step ahead of pain, they slowly step entirely outside of their own life. Instead of participating in the natural flow of existence, with all its inherent beauty and necessary uncertainty, they begin managing their life like a high-risk corporate project. Protection entirely replaces presence. They spend their days exhausted from constantly guarding the gates against ghosts of the future that may never actually arrive. So, what is the solution? How does a person who sees everything learn to live in a world that is too loud, too bright, and too complex? The answer is not to try and force your brain to shut down. You cannot simply turn off hyperawareness. That is like asking someone with 20/20 vision to purposely try and see the world as blurry. The goal is not to become less aware, less intelligent, or less observant. The solution is to stop carrying everything you see. In therapeutic settings, healing for the hyperaware person involves adjusting cognitive patterns and building robust, impermeable emotional boundaries. They must learn the art of selective detachment, the ability to notice things clearly, but actively refuse to absorb them. People who successfully manage to move beyond this burden and find peace usually anchor their lives in 3 freeing psychological principles. First, they internalize that not every silence is a hidden message. They learn to stop personalizing the behavior of the world around them. If someone takes 6 hours to reply to a text message, it does not automatically mean they are secretly angry or pulling away. Sometimes, people are just overwhelmed, exhausted, or distracted. If a coworker walks past your desk without smiling, they might just have a migraine. The hyperaware person learns to accept the most boring, benign explanation for human behavior rather than jumping to catastrophic conclusions. Second, they realize that not every emotion that appears needs an action to solve it. When a sudden wave of anxiety or a racing heartbeat shows up, they stop rushing to psychoanalyze it. Instead of spiraling, they practice somatic detachment. They say to themselves, "Oh, my heart is beating fast. I feel a tightness in my chest. It is just a physical sensation passing through my nervous system. It means nothing about my reality." They observe the feeling without judgment, remove the terrifying narrative attached to it, and simply let the cortisol process out of their body. Third, and most importantly, they accept that not every insight requires an intervention. This is the hardest lesson. A hyperaware person will always see the deep insecurities, the toxic patterns, and the hidden pain in the people around them. But seeing it does not make it their responsibility to heal it. They can notice that a friend is making a terrible relationship choice, but they realize they do not have to become that friend's savior. They can sense a toxic power dynamic forming in a room and realize that the healthiest, most intelligent response is simply to step back and let it play out without getting involved. They realize that profound clarity is only a gift when it comes paired with fierce boundaries. When a hyperaware person practices this kind of letting go, something remarkable begins to happen to their neurobiology. Their awareness does not disappear, but it softens. It matures. They still see deeply into the hidden realities of human nature, but they no longer cling desperately to the flaws of others. They can still feel the intense energy of a crowded room, but they are no longer violently pulled into its current. The fundamental shift happens entirely within. They move from using their intense awareness as a tool to predict danger, to using it as a tool to cultivate deep presence. They shift their baseline state from fear to curiosity. Instead of exhaustingly analyzing whether a stranger's smile was entirely genuine, they allow themselves to simply enjoy the warmth of a sunny afternoon and the taste of a good cup of coffee. Their life finally becomes lighter. This lightness does not occur because the outside world magically becomes simpler, or because the people around them suddenly become less complicated and messy. The world remains full of contradictions and hidden motives. Life becomes lighter because they finally decide to stop trying to carry the emotional equations of the entire world on their shoulders. If you are one of these people, understand this. You cannot turn off the blinding ceiling light in your mind. But you absolutely have the power to install a dimmer switch. You can consciously change the intensity of your perception. You can turn it from a harsh, clinical laser beam that exposes every terrifying flaw and hidden danger into a warm, gentle candle. A candle that is bright enough to help you understand the beautiful fragility of human nature, yet gentle enough to finally